Today is June 21st, 2024. This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And I'd like to take some time to respond to a question that I received this morning from a homeschooling parent who is concerned about all of the time that her son seems to be distracted by online activity and all the distractions of the internet and other websites and the challenges that presents to students who are working, studying online, using computers and so on. We had a good conversation on the phone, and I'd like to follow up on that conversation and talk about it a little more at length than I was able to during our phone call. There's no question that living in 2024, raising children in this generation, we've got a unique challenge to face, and that's handling technology, handling wireless internet technology, handling smartphones and tablets, all of this stuff, social media. We've got a unique challenge in our generation as parents, one that my parents didn't have to deal with, a challenge that I as a kid didn't need to struggle with. And I'm sure I would have handled it very badly. And I don't think my parents would have been able to stop, the interest that a child would have in these things. But as I was talking about it with a parent and just thinking through things, thinking about my own experience with my own children, I think it's possible to really nail down what should be our concerns with the use of the internet and computers and social media and all these things, and what we need to be careful to avoid doing. So I'd like to take some time to talk through that a little bit and hopefully offer something that's helpful, but most importantly, just get a discussion going that I think goes a little deeper than the discussion normally goes, because I think the popular surface level discussion is a little unrealistic, a little irresponsible, I would say, because it doesn't address what are the real challenges we face. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit. So when we look at the challenge we face here, technology has developed to the point where we have access to just incredible collections of resources. This started for me when I was in college. The internet developed and the libraries began giving access to digital content. And I remember as a college student, there was one database called Early English Books Online. And when that database became available, that's really where my classical Catholic education research started. I was able, as a 21-year-old college student with no money, to begin gathering and studying hundreds and hundreds of historical texts and learning about the history of classical education, of private school education, textbooks that were used, teaching manuals that were written from the 15th century through the 18th and 19th centuries. And all of that initial research was made possible because of a digital database that opened up for me as a Rutgers student. And I mean, that was probably 1997, somewhere around there, 1990, probably 97. And I have been working with similar resources, even though there's much more available now than there was then. But I've been working with digital resources for over 25 years, and that's really where all of my research has taken place. It's taken place from my own desk, my own office. I've never had to travel to do research or anything like that. Just really incredible, powerful, affordable tools that have become available to us, especially for those involved in any sort of historical research, through internet technology and computing. And when we come full, all the way through to 2024, where now we've got Zoom meeting rooms and just more and more tools that are made possible because of increasing internet speeds and bandwidth and things like that. We've really got to ask ourselves, what is the best use of this technology, whether we're just doing old-fashioned school things on computers or whether we're actually stepping back and rethinking education, because the technology really opens up amazing opportunities for us, especially when, as Christians, we're separated geographically. It allows the best teachers and the best resources to become accessible everywhere. And that can't be anything but good for us and for our children. And yet, to access these resources, to access these tools, to make use of these benefits, we've got to accept that there are some risks in this. And those risks, I think, terrify some parents. And in most cases, I would say this is pretty common, parents overreact to these risks and just cut their children off from all of these benefits. I understand why they do that. I understand what their concerns are, but I think we might be overreacting and really be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that's what I'd like to talk about. Now, I have my own 10 children. I know all of the problems. I know all of the issues. We've dealt with all of them with our own children. At first, when we were just getting started, I think we were really frightened about our kids accessing bad stuff. And remember, we were Protestants when our first children were born, and became Catholics when our oldest child was 5 or 6 years old. So we were already getting into parenting and things like that before we even became Catholic. And we thought about things a certain way. We had certain views at the time. And as we studied and examined those views, many of our views have changed because we've understood more of the Catholic faith and true teaching about human nature, about the nature of the Christian life, about the goals of parenting and evangelization, and so on. And, some of the truths of the Christian faith are unpleasant to learn of because, let's face it, they make life a lot more difficult. It's very pleasant to say, all that matters is that you read your Bible and have a personal relationship with Jesus. You don't need to be a part of a church. You don't listen to a pope. You don't need to be subject to any authority. Just read your Bible, pick your favorite hymns, go to church if you want to, but if you don't want to, that's okay. And just develop a personal relationship with Jesus. That message is very pleasant to a selfish person. That message is very comforting, but it's not true. And when we learn the truth of the Christian life, when we learn, for example, that the church, Jesus says, is like a dragnet full of sort of a mixed catch, right? There's good fish and bad fish. You've got some eels stuck in there, and then there's, what you're actually hoping to catch. And he says the church, the kingdom of God, is like a great net, and it's pulled up on shore, and it's got all kinds of stuff in it. And at the end of the age, the Lord will go through and he'll sort out the good from the bad. And so the church is not supposed to be, not even promised to be, some sort of communion of living saints kept free from all distractions and all bad characters. It's a dragnet filled with a mixed catch, as I said. And we're called to enter into that community. We're called to love our neighbor in that community. We're called to worship God within that community. And learning to live as a member of the church as it truly is, without any romantic ideas of what it should be or any idealistic pictures of what we're supposed to make it appear to be. We have to learn to live with lots of different people that we don't necessarily agree with, that we don't necessarily like personally, But we have to look at each other and consider that Jesus is the Lord of the church, and he came into the world to save sinners, not to save good people. He said, I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And so the church is going to be filled with repenting sinners in the process of sanctification, and that makes things very difficult at times. So that message of the necessity of the visible church, the authority of the Pope and the bishops, the fact that leaders of the church are still fallible and human in terms of, I shouldn't say fallible, that could get confusing, but I would say defectible personally, that individual church leaders can fall into sin and things like that. We've got to deal with scandals in the church. And these aren't signs that the church is abandoned or that the church has apostatized. It's what the church is. The church is the communion of men and women joined together through the sacrament of baptism who are progressing in sanctification towards salvation. And there are some bad characters mixed in with the good characters. And we're called to live in that community. And that makes Christianity more difficult. It's not this easy life where, oh, we found this bad person, so we're going to leave this church and go and start another church where only good people are allowed. And we're going to be really strict with our admission requirements and say, only good people can come into our church. We're not letting any questionable characters, any weird people, only people who look like us, dress like us, like the music that we like, and so on. It's a church just for us. That's not real Christianity. So we see real Christianity makes life difficult. It's challenging. When we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we read Jesus saying things like, if someone asks you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles. If someone asks you for their cloak or for your cloak, give him your tunic also. Go above and beyond. Be generous. Love one another. Help one another. Bear one another's burdens. Forgive one another. That community life that Jesus teaches is not practiced in most places that call themselves churches because they're trying to take an easier course rather than embracing the difficulty of the Christian life. And when we come to parenting, we have the same dilemma. When it comes to parenting, there's a way which seems right to most Christian parents. And it's, this idea that our children are born into the world as these pure little angels, and the big bad world around us is going to corrupt them and make them bad. And so what we've got to do is we've got to isolate our children so that the world can't make them bad. And if we can successfully keep them isolated, they will be able to make it through life, or maybe just childhood, and we'll be able to keep them pure, and that's how someone becomes good. Someone becomes good by being kept in this sort of original state of innocence after birth. And as I talk about that, I hope you can realize that's not Christian teaching. That's not the true teaching on the nature of man. Man born into the world is not pure. Man is not free from corruption. Man is fallen, and even if baptized, he still lives with concupiscence, which is an inclination to evil. And so our little children are not good. They're not pure. They're not innocent. They're given grace in the sacrament of baptism, and they are brought into the community of the church, and they receive many graces as members of the church, but they are not innocent. They're not pure. They're corrupt. They're fallen. They are affected by original sin. They live with concupiscence, as I said, an inclination towards evil. And we see that when they're young, even before they reach the age of reason, we see how they're inclined to selfishness, to nastiness, to violence, and so on, as little toddlers. So this idea that we often have that our little babies are born as these pure little cherubs coming into the world, and what we've got to do is build a wall around them and protect them from the bad guys. That's true to an extent. because obviously we do need to protect them from things that are more powerful than them and destructive. We've even got to protect them from themselves. But they also are creatures composed of body and soul who have free will. And for us as parents, when these children reach age 18, they're going to become legally free birds. And they can pack up on their 18th birthday, walk out the front door, and jump off a cliff if they want to. They're going to have freedom to make all kinds of decisions in their lives, and there's really nothing that we can do to stop them because they're going to be independent adults. So the real challenge of parenting is not to keep these little angels in a cage, free from all outside corruption. That's really not the challenge of parenting. Because we can keep things away, but that day of independence is always waiting when they're just going to be able to run into anything that they want. And so it won't matter how much we've shielded them from if they're just going to run into it without restraint at age 18. So keeping them free from corruption really isn't the duty of parenting, even though parents who live a good Christian life will keep their children free from many forms of corruption. That's really not the challenge for parents. The challenge for parents is really to teach their children, to help their children learn to handle freedom responsibly. And that's a much more uncomfortable, much more difficult challenge. We're challenged to raise children to learn to handle freedom responsibly. And the only way that we can raise children to handle freedom responsibly is to actually help them practice handling freedom responsibly. And, so this idea of just keeping them from every potential evil, even if it's not an intrinsic evil, something, for example, like using the internet. The internet is not intrinsically evil. There's definitely evil available on it if you search for it, but it's not intrinsically evil. And so when a person gets onto the internet, what's put to the test is their ability to use freedom responsibly. And when we give our children access to the internet, we see that that's what they have to deal with. They have to deal with this challenge to use freedom responsibly. And so they've got access to all kinds of stuff. I mean, stuff that I never could have dreamed of when I was a kid. When I was a kid, we had, let's say, Saturday morning cartoons were on television. So if you got up early on Saturday and got downstairs, you could turn on the television and there were cartoons on, I think, until midday on Saturday mornings. And so you could watch cartoons. Or when you came home from school, from like 3 to 5 o'clock, there were cartoons on television. So if you wanted to see a cartoon, you had to be at the television from 3 to 5 on weekdays and in the morning on Saturdays, and you could watch cartoons. And you had no control over which cartoons, what episodes of the cartoons. You just had to watch whatever came on. Now, these kids can go on YouTube or go on some other website and they can binge watch every episode of Woody Woodpecker that was ever made. When I was a kid, I would have gone nuts if I could do something like that. And I'll admit it, when I see, 57 episodes of Tom and Jerry on some YouTube playlist, I say, man, I could sit down and binge watch that thing because it's just great entertainment. And these kids have access to sources of entertainment that aren't bad, but it's just such an incredibly easy and affordable access to so much stuff. Music, there's just no limit to what's accessible to these kids. And what's most amazing about it is that it's so much of it is free. So much of it requires no payment. You just click and access it. Music videos, movies, cartoons, shows, books, on and on and on. Just freely accessible online. And there's no way to deny that what these kids have access to, not to mention video games and stuff, it's just really hard to comprehend how much stuff is available. And I don't think it's true. I don't think it's fair to say this is evil. It's incredibly happy to have access to all this fun stuff. And so we see that the challenge that our kids face, the challenge they face, is to learn to use these things with moderation, to learn to have self-control, to learn to use freedom responsibly. And it's a very great challenge. And so when we undertake a task like homeschooling our children, and we say, well, you know, if we use the internet, if we work with an online program like I run in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, if we use an online program, we have access to all of this amazing curriculum content, assessments, services, grade books, reporting, all of this stuff. We have access to everything from the comfort of our home that's available in a private school. However, if we go to use these online resources, we're also going to be tempted to hop onto Google and search for Wile E. Coyote and go off on a Roadrunner cartoon binge. So we've got this good and bad. And then of course there's real evil. There's a kid can get on there and search for evil things and find them. But realize, realistically, I talked about this in my phone conversation today. If you look, the companies like Facebook and Google and Microsoft, they are taking responsible measures. They are really making an effort to make the internet safe for us to use. If you type in innocent search keywords, if you search for Alexander the Great, if you search for Julius Caesar or Jesus Christ or the history of the United States, the search results don't come up with all kinds of filth and immoral images on the screen. Many people talk about the internet as if that's the case, but that's not the case. For a kid to access something bad, he's going to have to intentionally search for it and click around until he finds it. And I don't think it's fair to blame things like that on Google or on Facebook or on Microsoft. That's an unsupervised kid on a computer. That's a parental problem. The kids should never be unsupervised. And so there's a difference between having a few minutes to click around on the internet and having 2 hours to actually search and click and dig deeper and deeper until you finally find some bad content. So I think that we should be thankful and respectful towards the tech companies because they do put up an initial level of protection to keep kids safe. And when kids get into bad stuff, it's because they're being bad kids. It's really not because anyone on the outside is throwing stuff at them. So we've got to be honest and understand how things work. I think the internet is pretty safe for any child who's supervised, to a reasonable degree. I'm not talking about mom sitting next to him staring at the screen constantly. I'm talking about just checking in every couple minutes, making sure the kid's doing what he's supposed to do and so on. I think when kids are supervised like that, even if they do mess around a little bit, they might be getting into some silly stuff or something, but it's not that easy to get into bad stuff. And talk of fear like that, like there's some kind of horrible pedophile waiting, at every click of the mouse. That's really not true. That's exaggerating, and we really need to distance ourselves from that kind of crazy talk. The kids need to be supervised. We need to check on what they're doing. They need to know that we're watching. And, we also need to be realistic to teach the kids, again, the real lesson, which is you need to practice self-control. You need to get your work done. You need to follow your schedule. You need to do what your parents tell you to do. You need to use your time to get your studies done every day. And, if you get your studies done, there will be time to have some fun or to play a little bit. But you've got to learn to have self-control. You've got to learn that there's a proper time and place for everything. There's a time to play games. There's a time to relax and watch a silly show. There's a time to listen to some music. But that time is not during your scheduled study time. And if you commit to making good use of your study time, will allow you to have some time to have responsible leisure. You've got to learn how to use freedom responsibly. And that's what the kids constantly need to be taught. You need to learn to use freedom responsibly, because you're going to have freedom, and the temptations and the distractions of life are going to be much, much greater when you're 18 years old than they are right now when you're 10 years old. The distractions are going to be much greater, and I would say much more dangerous. Something I'll talk about in a minute. But that's the message we need to communicate to the kids. You have freedom. God has given you freedom. God respects your freedom. God wants you to love him freely. He doesn't force you to love him. He doesn't put you inside of a cage in order to make it appear that you love him. He puts you in a world where there's all kinds of tempting, pleasurable, destructive stuff, and he commands you to love him, but he commands you to love him while giving you your freedom to do what you please. And the perfect example of this is the Garden of Eden. When God created Adam and Eve, they were his prize creatures. He created them to love and to enjoy, to have a reciprocal love and enjoyment of one another. And yet he allowed them to live in the presence of evil. He gave them access to good things. He gave them access to bad things. And he commanded them to choose what's good and avoid what's evil. And then he left them in freedom. And in their freedom, they chose to do evil. And what did he do? He punished them. He didn't destroy them. He didn't annihilate them. He didn't pour sulfur and fire out of heaven and kill everything. He came to them, and then Adam and Eve chose to hide from him. And he says, "Where are you?" And then they say, "Oh, I was naked, so I hid." And he says, "Well, who told you were naked? Did you eat from the tree?" And Adam confesses that he ate and says that the woman who you gave me, she gave me to eat. And then he says to the woman, "Why did you do this?" And she says, "Well, the serpent tempted me and I ate." And then God punishes the serpent and the woman and the man. So they get punished, but not destroyed. They get punished quite severely, but not destroyed, and they're given a second chance. They're given a second chance. And so God punishes them. He takes them out from the Garden of Eden. He separates them from the tree of life, and he puts them under a curse. He punishes them. He says to the man, your work is going to be cursed. By the sweat of your brow, you're going to eat your bread. And to the woman, he says, I am going to greatly multiply your sorrow in childbearing. And so they are put under a curse. They're punished, but they're not destroyed. And they're given a second chance. They're given another chance to handle freedom. Now, they've lost many of the benefits they had because they lost trust, and they proved by their disobedience that they cannot handle freedom responsibly. But God doesn't take freedom away from them. He punishes them to teach them a lesson and to help them use their freedom more responsibly, and he gives them another chance and another chance and another chance. And if you think about Christ's command that if your brother sins against you, forgive him 70 times, 7 times. We're given chance after chance after chance to prove that we can and will freely do what we're supposed to do. And that's really the challenge of the Christian life. And this is a theme that runs through literature and music. I'll save that discussion, but this concept of forcing people to choose what they should choose freely is central to the gospel. God commands us to love him. He commands us to love our neighbor, but he leaves us to choose to do so freely. He has the power and the right to punish us, and if he wanted to, he could destroy us. But he chooses to bear with us and give us the opportunity to learn from our mistakes, to amend our lives, and more, little by little, to learn to handle freedom responsibly. And that lesson is really what's in focus when we're raising our children and dealing with something like the internet. Now, in my discussion today, I wanted to encourage this mother because I know this can get overwhelming at times. But I just wanted to pump the brakes on this idea that kids have some kind of worse situation today than we had when we were kids. I think the opposite is true. I think the situation that kids have today is much better than the situation that we had when I was a kid. And let me explain. When I was a kid, freedom for us, at least where I lived in my family, freedom for us meant playing in the street. When I was 7 years old, I could hop on my bike and ride a half mile away or so to 7-Eleven and buy myself some baseball cards and a Slurpee. I could hop on my bike and ride around town. I was 7 years old. I remember when I was 5 years old, my mother invited my school friends, and we had a birthday party at Burger King outside of my school. And I remember being so excited to be 5 years old because being 5 years old meant that I was allowed to go across the big back parking lot on the other side of our property and play with all the big kids. You know, I was able to do that because I turned 5. We had freedom, but our freedom was in the streets. Our freedom was, around town on the sidewalks, going to stores, going to the mall when we got older, middle school, high school years. We had freedom in the streets when I was a kid. So you could go out and run down the street and go to your friend's house and go out in the back field and play. You could go down to the end of the road and go in the woods behind the church where there was a walking trail back there, and we would go. But we'd be up and down the streets all around town on our bikes at 7 and 8 years old. I remember I got attacked by a German Shepherd on my bike. And, I remember the day I was riding my bike to my grandmother's house. She was, 5 or 6 blocks away. And I was riding my bike, and a German Shepherd came running out of a house, jumped over the fence and attacked me and pulled me off my bike. And I think about that, and then I think, I was 8 years old when that happened. I was 8 years old riding my bike around town freely when I got attacked by a German Shepherd. Didn't do anything to me, just chased me, grabbed me, and pulled me off my bike before the owner came out and called the dog in. But I was 8 years old when that happened. I would never let my kid get on a bike and just start pedaling off at 8 years old. I've got a son, Joshua, who likes to ride bikes, and I think he's like 15, and I'm uncomfortable with him just hopping on a bike and taking off. And he's a trustworthy kid, and we live out in the country. I was allowed to ride my bike freely around the town when I was 8 years old, even younger. So when I was a kid, freedom was a physical freedom. It was an outdoor freedom. It was out in the street freedom. Walking in and out of stores, carrying money, riding my bike around, going to different friends' houses in town, walking to school in the morning and in the afternoon, coming home. There was freedom, and it was an outdoor public freedom, actually in the presence of other people, moving vehicles, all kinds of stuff. That was a very different kind of freedom. And many older people talk about, when I was a kid, life was so much better because we could do this and that. And we think of all the positive things. We think of all the good things, all the good people who did nice things to us. But we tend to ignore or cover up all the bad things that happened. The people that we were around, people that we were with, things that we learned about that we should never have been around. And yet that was part of just being a kid when I was growing up. All kinds of dangerous things. I fell off the stadium bleachers at our high school when I was like 7 years old because we were just fooling around, running up and down, riding our bikes around on this giant set of high school bleachers and, doing stuff like that, going under the highways, crawling through, rainwater drains that ran under the highways. We used to crawl through the drains to get to the other side of the highway. My parents didn't even know where we were. And in my generation where I lived, that was just part of being free, being a kid, going out and playing with your friends and so on. So when I look at these problems we have today, and I hear parents complaining about the fact that the kids can click on a bad website or they can go and search on Google and look at some bad pictures. I think to myself, the danger that these kids face, and I'm talking about supervised kids, the danger these kids face with video games and access to websites or YouTube videos or Google image searches and things like that, I don't think that these things are anything remotely close to what I had access to when I was a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s. I don't think these kids face any of the danger. I mean, we lived in danger in the sense that, if you went into the wrong area or down the wrong street or didn't have your friends with you and ended up in a place where another group of kids was, you could get your face smashed in. You can get beaten to a bloody pulp in the street. Our kids don't face trouble like that. And so, are there troubles, potential troubles? Yeah, of course there are, especially for kids who are not supervised on the internet. And I mean, to be fair, I think it's a lot easier to supervise kids on the internet than it is to supervise them in the streets. But, we had problems with, kids were sexually active, physically sexually active when I was in 6th grade. I had friends who were already getting started with sexual activities, 6th grade. Hearing stories, things like that. When I was in 5th grade, still in elementary school, kids already messing around with stuff. But again, not looking at pictures of things, not watching a video of something that they shouldn't watch, but actually participating in those behaviors physically at that age. So when I think of the dangers that kids face today on the internet, I really don't think it's anything remotely close to as troublesome as things were 20, 30 years ago. And so I think the reaction to it, this sort of hypersensitive, prudish reaction, fearful, protective reaction to it is a little bit crazy and may even lead to worse circumstances than are really present. For example, let's say it's a Friday night in my house. And, my kids will say, "Hey, Dad, would you mind if we play some video games for a while?" And my kids are home and they're together and they want to play, whatever game they're playing. I'll say, "Yeah, sure, that's fine. I don't care if you play some games for a while." So think about what's going on here. My kids sitting in the living room together, playing some games, some video games on the television in the living room. They're not out drinking. They're not out driving and getting into car accidents. They're not out on dates with people I don't know. They're not wandering through the mall like we did when I was kids. They're sitting in the living room together playing video games. I think that's good, right? The kids are all safe. They've got their schoolwork done. It's a Friday night or it's after school, whatever. These things can be done in moderation. These things can be done with some temperance. And I think it's kind of crazy to say, no, we're going to have a zero computer policy, zero video game policy, because what's the alternative? Well, what's the real alternative to that? And when I look around and see families who try to do those things, it seems like those things are done for the benefit of the parents because they don't want to have to supervise. They don't want to have to learn how to control things and how to make good use of things. They don't want to learn how to use these devices and services and things like that in a positive way. They would just rather shut it all down and avoid it. And I think it's selfish. And what I ask is, what is the alternative that's presented to the kids in its place, and how is it better? How is it better than what they could be doing? And what I often find, as I said, is it's very easy to say no to kids. It's very easy to say, you can't do this, you shall not do this, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this, and just go on and on and on with an endless lists of things that you are not allowed to do, and feel good that we're just so strict. We're such strict parents. But what are the positive things that the kids are allowed to do? And is it realistic, this list of positive things, or are we parenting in a way that St. Paul warns about when he says, "Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Do not suck the soul out of them. Do not suck the air out of them. Do not drive the life out of them," right? Do not exasperate your children. And when I look and see what some families do, some Christian families, I think that's what they're doing. I think that they're setting up a false dilemma, and the false dilemma is you're either going to live like Dominic Savio or Aloysius Gonzaga, or you can run away and just disappear and fall off the face of the earth. We're not going to have kids who are like Dominic Savio and Aloysius Gonzaga. They are historical oddities. They are child saints, and the reason why they're held in such honor in the church is because they're so extraordinarily rare. To pretend that they're the default Christian child, like, all you little girls, you should all be like Maria Goretti. That's what you're supposed to be like. That's not true. Maria Goretti is an extraordinary individual saint, or like Saint Therese. The saints are not models of normal Christian life. They're examples of extraordinary graces given to individuals. It's like saying that every man should be just like Thomas More, or every priest should be just like St. John Vianney. It's not true. It's not true any more than every evangelist should be like St. Paul, or every pope should be like St. Peter. It's not true. These are men given extraordinary graces, and they have extraordinary vocations at significant points of time in history. They're not the model of the normal Catholic life. They're the model of the perfect Catholic life. And so when we have children, we don't, just because William and Dania Michael, who think they're so great, have children, doesn't mean that all their boys are little Dominic Savios and all their girls are little Maria Gorettis. That's just a crazy, arrogant view of family life. The truth is we give birth to human beings. They've got their own strengths, their own weaknesses, their own goods, their own evils, and we learn that pretty quickly. And that's all normal. They have their own vocation between them and the Lord, which they're going to discern and respond to in their own way as they enter into adult life. They're like strawberries that branch off from the mother and eventually are separated to go and grow by themselves. They have their own life and their own vacation, and trying to control that is not the duty of parents. Aloysius Gonzaga and Saint Therese are not normal Catholic children. Our children should not be expected to be like Maria Goretti and Dominic Savio. They should be expected to be like all of the millions and millions and millions of normal Catholic kids that we don't read stories about, who are just normal kids with their own strengths and weaknesses, living their own lives, many of whom went on to become good Catholics, many of whom will be in heaven. But we don't tell stories about the ordinary 8 and 10 and 14-year-olds. And yet our children are the normal 8, 10, and 14-year-olds. So what we've got to ask is not, what would the ideal be? What would Dominic Savio do on a Friday night? But what is good for our children to do, considering the actual options that they have? And to extend that thought, to think about the culture that we make available to our children when they're 8 years old, 10 years old, 14 years old, 17 years old, will affect what they do when they're 18 and 20 and 24 years old. We can establish a culture in our family that is extremely strict, extremely, just focused constantly on religion, focused constantly on studies and prayers and going to Mass and so on. But we're going to have kids in those circumstances who are normally counting the days until they're free. And when they're free, they're going to say, I can't wait to just shake off this miserable life that mom and dad have imposed on me, that I haven't chosen, that we've never been able to have any fun or relaxation or vacation or leisure. It's just always been You need to keep your nose to the grindstone. You need to keep working, do your chores, constantly study, constantly work. Anything else is considered idleness and sin. Those kids are just going to be waiting for the day when they can throw that off. And those are the kids that run off the rails at 18. As soon as they get their freedom, they are completely unprepared to handle that freedom. And what that really is, that is a failure to prepare children for their real life. And again, it has an appearance of serious devotion. It has an appearance of responsibility. It has an appearance of vigilance and strictness. But what it's actually doing is ignoring the actual challenge of parenting, which is preparing kids for freedom. It's totally neglecting the duty of preparing kids and helping kids to understand and make responsible use of the freedom that they're going to have once they reach legal adulthood. And so it's not serious Christian parenting. It's not responsible Christian parenting. It has an appearance, but it's a shallow appearance. They're actually neglecting the real difficulty, the real challenge, because this challenge of teaching our kids to handle responsibility, it is a pain in the neck. It is exhausting. It requires constant attention. It requires constant vigilance. We've got to constantly, deal with them, teach them, talk to them, catch them fooling around again, talk about it, forgive them, give them another chance. We've got to continually work through this and work through this and work through this and help them to learn to use their freedom responsibly. We've got to help them to learn that being punished for something is worse than controlling yourself and enjoying something with moderation. That's what we've got to teach them, that concept. And we even see this concept in the judgment of the world. We see that for Christian people, even if they struggle, there is purgatory, where the temporal punishments due for your sins can be paid after death. But for those who will not repent, those who choose to use their freedom only for evil, they're ultimately given what they want. They're given freedom from all goodness in hell. But those who make an effort, who try to turn towards God, to choose what is good, even if they struggle, they're welcomed into eternal life. They're purified, they're purged, even after death, received through the mercy of Christ. But those who will never use their freedom for good, they're the ones who ultimately freely choose to be separated from God, and God gives them what they desire in the end. So our challenge is to teach our kids to handle freedom. Now, again, for my parents, even though they weren't Christians, my mother was a good mother, even though she wasn't a practicing Catholic. She was a good mother, and she was strict with me, taught us, warned us of things. I knew that if I got caught doing bad stuff, I'd get in trouble, and there were eyes and ears all over town because my parents had friends all over the place, and if I was somewhere I shouldn't be, my mom would get a phone call. If I was 10 minutes late coming home from school, my mom would call the cops and have the cops go look for me in the street because my mother and father were friends with the police officers in our town. So there was freedom, but there were restraints. But my parents gave me freedom, and I think a lot of the strength and confidence that I have as an adult came from those lessons that I learned handling freedom as a kid. And now, when I think about the challenge my parents faced with their kids learning to be free out in the streets, compared to my challenge to teach my kids and help my kids learn how to be free using things like the internet, I think the challenge that I face is much, much easier than the challenge that they face. I mean, I had friends get hit by cars and all kinds of crazy stuff. I had a kid get hit by a car right in front of my face one time, just came running out of his house down his driveway on a bike, tore out into the road, and just as he came out of the driveway into the road, there was a car coming full speed right there that nailed him. And I saw these things growing up because we were free kids. The stuff my kids face is nothing like that. Nothing like that. So, the question is really like, what are we really complaining about? What are we so upset about? Are we upset because a kid's wasting some time because he doesn't study 24 hours a day? Because if we open a computer in front of him, he doesn't dive into the most challenging studies and stay focused and engaged the entire time? So we start to doubt whether we should use computers. We start to doubt whether we should use the internet, whether we should homeschool. Maybe we should just send the kids to school. And what I asked the mother today is, do you think that kids at school don't goof around and not pay attention and, get into trouble and fool around? Like, what do you think they do? You think they're locked in the whole time? No, I mean, I was a school kid. We hardly ever paid attention in school. So the kids on the computers, they're doing exactly the same thing that kids are doing in the classroom. It just looks different. And the difference is that if you send a kid to the school, that kid could goof around and not pay attention all day. And as a parent, it's none of your business. As long as the grades are decent, you can just ignore it day to day. And you're not on that kid all day, every day, from the time he wakes up till the time he falls asleep. You can just drop him off and go on your way, la-di-da through your daily activities and chores and not have to worry about that. But when the kid is home, when your children are with you at home, you're the one who has to deal with that all day long. And so you get frustrated with it and think that somehow sending them to school would solve that problem, but it won't. It will simply take that problem away from you, but it's not going to solve the problem. The kid's going to do the same thing with possibly even worse conditions. I know in my case, I can explain how the conditions that I faced at school were worse than things that my kids face at home. Because in school, you have no control over the kids who are there. You have no control over the teachers who are there. You have no control over the parents of the kids who are there and what kind of evil they're into. On the internet, things are much safer. So I really don't understand what all of the crazy fear and trembling is with respect to the internet. We're not sitting little cherubs in front of these computers with these blank slate souls. We're not modern Epicureans, or we're not followers of Lockean philosophy about human nature. That's one of the errors of modern society, even of much of Protestantism. We believe our children are born under the effect of original sin, and they're concupiscent. They're inclined to evil. So when we see them inclining to evil, that's not some extraordinary actual sin that they're committing. That's just human nature. That's human nature. And the solution for that is in learning how to handle freedom, learning how to practice self-control. And that learning takes time. It takes time. One of the ways that they learn is actually by experiencing certain things and just realizing that they're not that interesting. I mean, for me, for example, I'm 49 years old, grew up loving sports. You couldn't pay me to get interested in sports at this point in my life. If I see a sports highlight or news, 99.9% of the time, I just say boring. Whereas when I was a kid, I was a sports addict. But over time, I just got tired of it. I've seen it all. How many Super Bowls are you going to watch? How many, basketball championships are you going to sit there and watch before you realize, I don't even remember who won last year. Who cares about this stuff? There's much cooler stuff to be pursuing than watching this year's championship game. You just get tired of it after a while because it's not capable of satisfying a human soul. It's not going to keep us occupied forever. We're going to get tired of it. Many of these things that the kids are interested in, they're interested in just because they're novel, because it's interesting and new. And if the kid actually did it for a few minutes or watched the show for a few minutes or listened to the song for a few minutes, they'd realize this is pretty boring and they'd move on. And that's how we get through these things. That's why after a while we learn rather than getting into it, just say, well, that stuff is always looks cool, but when you do it, it's boring. I'm not going to fall for that stuff anymore. That's what it means to have experience, to just become mature. And our kids are going to have experience. They're going to become mature, especially when we're dealing with younger kids, because they're just foolish. They're just foolish children. They have no experience. They have no practical wisdom. They have no discernment or judgment. They're just kids. But what happens, as I was explaining in my conversation today, is these kids are going to go through puberty. They're going to change. Their bodies are going to change. Their minds are going to change. And when they become 15, 16 years old, they're going to start desiring adult things. They're going to start to want to do adult things, go to adult places, do adult things. And I'm not using the word adult in the modern bad sense, like, oh, this is okay for adults, but not for children. I'm just talking about mature things. They're going to want to go to college. They're going to want to drive a car. They're going to want to be able to look for a spouse and talk to girls and go on dates and things like that. They're going to want to do mature stuff, and that's going to make them take life more seriously. They're going to realize that their friends in high school are graduating and going to college, and they've got all this exciting opportunity ahead of them, and they're looking forward to it. And our kids are going to realize, hey, I'm not ready for college. I'm not on pace to get my diploma. I better get my act together and work, because I'm going to miss out on all these cool things that I could be doing. And so as they get older, they start to mature, they start to desire adult things, and by the time they're 16, 17, usually they're starting to lock in and get their work done. And it's just part of the normal process of maturation for kids growing up. So when it comes to computers and things like that, what I'd like to say in this talk is I'd like to challenge parents to just step back and ask themselves, am I really focusing on the real challenge of parenting, which is helping my children to learn to use freedom responsibly? Am I doing a good job at that? Am I giving attention to that? Am I helping my children to focus on that and think about that? Think about using freedom responsibly. Am I helping my kids to understand that there are good things and better things? There are good things and worse things, but still kind of good things, but there's a time and a place, or there's a certain degree, there's a certain amount that's okay. Ice cream is good. 6 bowls of ice cream is gluttony. It's not the ice cream that changes, it's the use of it that's changed. And so the virtue of temperance, of self-control, is part of what should be focused on. We shouldn't be demonizing everything that has the potential to be used for evil, because that's true of everything. And some parents, that's how they raise their kids. They raise their kids where almost everything is blamed for sin rather than the child, which is really the only person in the room who can sin is the human being. It's not the stuff. And Jesus says, to the pure, all things are pure. And so we've got to ask ourselves, as parents, are we actually telling our kids things that are consistent with Christian teaching about sin and righteousness and virtue? Or have we just run off the rails and we're treating our kids, we're like practically living as heretics who believe that human beings are born innocent and they're corrupted by external influences unless they're isolated from them and protected from them? That's not Christian teaching. And many parents are saying the right things, when they talk about the faith, but what they practice is false teaching, based on false teaching. So I'd like to challenge parents to just take some time to ask, am I focused on actually training my children in virtue? Am I teaching my kids, making them conscious of the virtue of self-control? Am I helping my kids to learn the benefits of self-control, to enjoy the rewards of self-control? Am I allowing my kids to experience the negative consequences of a lack of self-control? Am I teaching my kids how to handle freedom responsibly? Am I teaching my children how to use freedom for good and how to resist evil in freedom? Am I teaching my kids to balance their time, to work when it's time to work, and to hold off on leisure and play until it's time for leisure and play? Am I teaching my kids to be self-controlled human beings composed of body and soul to whom God has given free will am I teaching my kids to live responsibly in freedom? That's the challenge. It's easy to fake it and create this super strict life where you simply don't allow your children any freedom. Why didn't God do that in the Garden of Eden? If that's a good idea, why didn't God do that with Adam and Eve? Why did God allow them to live in the presence of evil and give them the option to choose good or evil? So I'd like you to think about that, and I'd like you to think about what your answers to those questions would be, and then think of how those answers and those issues affect what we ought to do and how we ought to manage our children's education, parenting, daily schedule, leisure activities, and so on. Because I think many Christians are reacting irresponsibly to the challenge that we face. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and what they're going to end up doing is actually harming rather than helping, putting their children at a disadvantage rather than giving them advantages. And so I'd like to challenge parents to think about that and give me your thoughts. I'd like to know what you think. If you think that what I say is stupid, I'd like for you to explain why. If you have experienced some things, either good or bad, that you think shed some light on this issue and help to clarify things, I sincerely would like to know about your experiences, because in my experience, I think Catholics, Christians are erring in trying to be too strict and demonize things that have a potential for great good and a potential for evil. And it comes down to us, not these things. And I think we need to think about using them for good rather than using them for evil. So anyway, I hope that helps. Something I wanted to share, which, I am constantly thinking about as I work with my kids, choosing my battles, like what do I really, if I'm going to have an argument with one of my kids, what am I going to argue about? Am I going to argue about a video game on a Friday night? Am I going to argue about watching some goofy fails video on YouTube? Is that really what I need to fight and argue with my kid about? Or should I be thinking about other things, concerned about other things? And maybe the reason why the kids are idle in the first place is because I'm not providing them with enough good stuff to do. And I'm leaving them idle and unsupervised. And I'm actually the cause of some of their problems by not providing for them sufficiently. So think about that, chew on it. Think of scripture passages that shed some light on this issue. Think about examples from church history, church fathers, catechism questions, anything that you think might help on this issue. And please share it either in the comments or privately with me by email. Because as I seek to understand what we ought to do and practice it as a parent and advise other parents who ask me for practical advice as an experienced teacher, these are my thoughts on the issue. But I'm constantly questioning myself, rethinking things, looking at my kids, asking if I'm right, and I'd love your feedback as well. So I hope that's helpful. God bless.